Hi, our readings for this module on Islamicate and Arabic medical science are by Peter Poorman and Fabian Cass. They're chapters from the Routledge Handbook on the Sciences and Islamicate Societies, practices from the 2nd/8th to the 13th/19th centuries, a 900-page comprehensive scholarly resource with contributions from dozens of premier historians of Islam. This isn't your typical undergraduate history reading. Massive compendia like this offer enormous amounts of information with less context, less analysis, and less historiographic framing. They kind of position themselves as the end-all be-all reference text for the subject at hand. Based on the way a compendium like this is compiled and edited, they assume that the audience will mostly be professionals and specialists, not undergrads. And so this chapter was written with scholars of Islamic culture in mind, and so it assumes a sturdy foundation of background knowledge on Islamic cultural and imperial political history. There will probably be a lot of references to historical texts and personages that you're unfamiliar with. They were for me anyway. So just try not to be bogged down with all of the names and dates. But I hope what you do take away from this reading is the level of sophistication of Islamicate and Arabic medical science and practice in the medieval period. Islamic scholarly activity in science has historically been downplayed, especially by Europeans and apologists of Eurocentrism, who view Europe and its settler colonies as the exclusive progenitors of scientific knowledge. Or worse, in Brentia's words, the existence of Islamic scholarly culture has been flatly denied. For centuries, most European travelers to the Ottoman Empire report that no sciences or liberal arts existed there. I don't want you to fall into the same trap. I'm assuming that for many of you, your knowledge of Islamicate and Arabic history of science isn't as deep as your knowledge of Euro-American history of science. That's okay, because our inherited knowledge is a product of the cultures we were raised in, and our culture has tended to undervalue or devalue Islamicate and Arabic scientific history. That's ironic, because European civilization owes a great intellectual and cultural debt to the scholars of the Islamic Golden Ages. During much of the Middle Ages, European knowledge of classical Western, that is Greek and Latin, philosophy and scientific thought was, for the most part, lost. All the while, for centuries, scholars in the Near and Middle East were preserving, translating, studying, commenting on, correcting, and building upon these texts from Greek and Roman antiquity. When Christendom and the Muslim Caliphate began to interact in the Iberian Peninsula and in Anatolia, texts that scholars in the Arabic Islamic world had been nurturing and elaborating began to re-enter Christian Europe. The big takeaway from this week is that Islamic and Arabic societies weren't just holding on to Western culture for Europeans and then returning it once Europeans had sorted themselves out from the collapse of the Roman Empire. It's that, despite their linguistic, religious, and geographic differences, both societies were inheritors to and participants in the Greco-Roman, that is larger Mediterranean, tradition of science and technology. Okay, a couple of things before we dig into it. Muslims use a different chronology and calendar than is used in Europe and Europeanized cultures. In case you didn't notice, the calendar we use here is Christian in nature. It's called the Gregorian calendar, after Pope Gregory XIII, who introduced it as a replacement for the Julian calendar. BC, as I'm sure you're aware, stands for before Christ, while AD, you may or may not be aware, stands for Anno Domini, Latin for in the year of our Lord. Why one of them is in English and one in Latin, actually I don't know, I should look that up, but you get the idea. This calendar divides up all the time of history in a way that pivots around the fulcrum of Jesus. Even the supposedly secularized update to this chronological system, BCE and CE, the Common Era, and before the Common Era, revolves around the life of Jesus of Nazareth. You can imagine that this might not be an ideal calendrical system for people from other religions who don't recognize Jesus' divinity. You've probably heard of the Mayan calendar and may be familiar with the Chinese dynastic calendar that divides chronology up into regnal periods of imperial rulers and families. Muslims use their own calendar, like that of the Christians, divides time up using a significant date in the religion's history, in this case the year that Muhammad and his followers migrated from Mecca to Medina. What in the Gregorian calendar would be the year 622 AD. So, when you see two different dates or centuries throughout this chapter, don't be confused, that's what you're seeing. I understand that this can be an impediment for people used to the Gregorian calendar. Just trying to learn history so you can pass your college class, and you're trying to keep track of all these dates, and suddenly every date is like 2 dates, and it's an unfortunate complication. But I think it's further evidence of the fact that this book's target audience is professional historians who are used to this kind of thing. It's also a gracious nod to Muslims, acknowledging that the Western calendar, and therefore Western knowledge in general, isn't the only valid way to organize and understand the cosmos. In that way, it illustrates very neatly one of the key takeaways from this module. The other thing I want us to get some clarity about before we get into the meat of this reading is the distinction between Islamic and Arabic. I know I'm stating the obvious, but it bears repeating that not all Arabic speakers are Muslim, and not all Muslims speak Arabic or are ethnically Arab. Arabic-speaking Christians, for example, direct their prayers to Allah, which is simply the Arabic word for God, not the specific name of the God of the Muslims, who, by the way, is the same historical, textual God as that of the Jews and the Christians, the so-called God of Abraham. I'd like to call your attention to one of the key figures in Islamic science, Tabit ibn Qurra, a mathematician and polymath who made breakthroughs in number theory and astronomy and mechanics and all kinds of cool stuff. Living in the 9th century, that is in the Gregorian calendar, Tabit worked as a money changer in the marketplace before being discovered and plucked from obscurity by one of the most famous scholars of the age, Muhammad ibn Musa. Tabit became one of the patronized scholars of the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate, but he himself was not Muslim. He was a Sabian of Haran. That's a Hellenized, Semitic, polytheistic astral religion. In plain language, he was a member of a Greek-speaking group of star worshippers with many gods. Anywho, our readings from this week from Poorman and Foss are brief, fewer than 10 pages each. Overviews of medical theory and surgical technology in the medieval Islamic world. The predominant medical philosophy, prominent in the Mediterranean world and derived from ancient Greek philosophy, was a combination of humoral theory and astrological and herbal medicine. And yes, for some reason, in the natural philosophical and natural historical context, people usually pronounce the H in herbal. I don't know what to tell you, academics are weird. Humoral elemental theory was the dominant explanatory paradigm for the human body and its relationship to illness, wellness, and the environment, from ancient Greece through the time of the quintessential Greco-Roman physician Galen, through the Islamic Golden Ages, and right up through the medieval period in Europe. And, as Poorman informs us, humoral theory's influence continues into the present through its impact on various extant medical traditions, including the Ayurvedic system of South Asia. Humoral theory divides the body and the world into elemental quadrants, moist and dry, warm and cool, which correspond to 4 fundamental fluids or humors derived from the Greek for juice or sap in the body: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. All states of being, all conditions, could be defined in terms of excesses or insufficiencies of these 4 substances. Environments, foods, and pharmaceuticals could all be described as containing or conditioning humoral balances or imbalances. Actually, medieval people made very little distinction between food and pharmaceutical substances, as they understood all food to have physiological properties that determined health outcomes, something European medical culture only lately seems to be rediscovering. As mentioned, humoral theory was originally developed in the ancient Greek world, possibly derived from ancient Egyptian medical theory, and continued to be elaborated upon in earnest for nearly 2,000 years by the various cultures and societies of the peri-Mediterranean region, including the Islamic societies of the medieval period. Sometimes the role of Islamic societies and scholars in this larger Mediterranean scientific tradition is portrayed as that of mere librarians or custodians, preserving and organizing knowledge created by others. In some ways, this is accurate, if simplistic, a representation of their relationship to knowledge, but only insofar as it is an accurate representation of all people's relationship to knowledge in this area around this time. Traditional knowledge was sacrosanct in both Islamic and Christian societies during the Middle Ages, and great importance was placed on its preservation and intergenerational transmission. Despite the medieval culture of knowledge, or to use the fancy word, episteme, Islamic scholars, and those of medieval Europe, despite our stereotypes about them, were not just passive stewards of ancient texts and knowledge contained therein. They actively worked to analyze and synthesize these texts with others, to comment on and to elaborate upon old knowledge. In short, to make knowledge. My hope for this module is that you come away from it with an understanding of the ancient knowledge system of the medieval Mediterranean world, and, more importantly, that the pagan Greco-Roman tradition is the shared inheritance of both Christian and Islamic societies, not the property of European civilization temporarily on loan to the Islamic world.